Welcome back to North Texas in Focus. My guest on the program today is Jeff Guinn, a Texas Literary Hall of Famer and the author of the new book, Waco, David Koresh, the Branch Davidians, and a Legacy of Rage. Jeff, thank you so much for joining the program today.
It's a real pleasure.
Just to start, this program is hosted on a college radio station, so there's probably a bunch of folks that might listen to this that have no idea about this incident. And then even for those that do know about what happened in Waco, it's one of those, snapshots in the American portrait that maybe people have seen but never taken a closer look at. So just a summary, what happened in Waco in the spring of 1993?
Just outside the Waco city limits, there was a compound known as Mount Carmel to the 135 people who lived there. They were a religious sect, that's S-E-C-T, not S-E-X, who were led by a man calling himself a prophet, David Koresh, claiming that he was the lamb of the biblical book of Revelation, and they were going to bring about the end times by battling the forces of Babylon, the U.S. government. Then was going to come 1,000-year kingdom of God. That's written in the Bible, and they took the Bible literally. They had any number of illegally owned automatic long guns, rifles, weapons that they had not registered as required by law or paid taxes on as required by law. In February 1993, agents of ATF, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, tried to raid the compound. They were met with gunfire. 4 of the agents died, 6 Branch Davidians. The FBI took over. A siege lasted 51 days. At the end of it, the FBI tried inserting tear gas. A fire broke out. Everyone left inside the compound, burned to death except 9 people who escaped. And ever afterward, conspiracy theorists have claimed the government had a plot to kill everybody there and tried to keep it quiet. The same people who have claimed that plot over the years were among those leading the assault on the U.S. Capitol in January 2021. So this happened 30 years ago, but the violence that has come from it, that is part of it, is still lasting today.
And for those of us who have never been a part of a group like that, a cult, we might not understand how the followers get involved with that. How do cult leaders not instantly get dismissed as quacks by their followers, such as, when Koresh suggested to his followers that God wanted him to have all of their wives? Why is there no pushback on stuff like that?
When we talk about cults, what we really mean, it's a group whose motivations it's hard for outsiders to understand, usually led by someone who is promising things most outsiders would think were ludicrous. It happens all the time, sometimes in religion, sometimes in politics. What will always happen with a demagogue, and David Koresh was one, is that they try first to tell their followers there's this terrible problem. Something's awful in the world, and I'm the only one who can protect you from it. Then you get your followers and you isolate them. In this case, in a compound a few miles outside the Waco city limits, and you have Bible study every day telling these people who already take the Bible literally that God has chosen them for a great task. They're going to bring about the end times, and by fighting Babylon, the new kingdom of God. Now remember, they really believe every word they see in the Bible means what Koresh tells them. He also tells them God wants sacrifice. If that includes the men giving up their wives and the women coming to Koresh willingly, that's part of it. Again, to us, who could ever believe that kind of garbage? And yet you're talking about people who had been there 3 years more listening to this over and over. They truly bought into what he said. And when that happens, when belief overcomes common sense, there's going to be trouble.
And when you talk about belief, the followers' belief to Koresh is one thing, but did Koresh truly believe what he was selling to his followers?
I've written books about other people who could be described as demagogues that maybe some of your listeners have heard of. Charlie Manson, Jim Jones in People's Temple, now David Koresh and the Branch Davidians. What every demagogue seems able to do, and again, we're not just talking about it in religion, but in politics, when they claim things that seem impossible, because those are the things they need to say to get people to follow them, to believe in them, to do what they're told by them. To a certain extent, they have to believe themselves. If they are saying it, it must be true. So once they feel like no matter what I think, no matter what I say must be correct, then they can sell it the same way a car salesman can sell you a car you might not have wanted originally, but he's telling you so many ways this car is going to make your life better and seems to truly believe it that you end up buying in. That's sort of a facile comparison, but it's a fair one. Demagogues sell and they find ways to convince people to buy in.
And were there ever, just one more on his followers, were there ever moments where any discord at Mount Carmel, any moments, any he's gone too far moments, or did they buy the company line from Koresh, hook, line, and sinker, 100% loyalty?
Over the 3 years or so, 3 or 4 years towards the end, when it's coming up to 1993, every once in a while, some of his followers would just be disgusted or upset by something he proclaimed was a message from God, and they would leave. Over this time, let's say there might have been 250 men, women, and children in the course of 3 or 4 years. And possibly as many as a third said, "Oh, come on, I believed everything so far. This is too much," and they left. But the others stayed. At the time of the raid, there's about 140 people living in Mount Carmel, and every one of them is there because now they have bought into everything Koresh said. The other thing we have to remember, there are always going to, just as there always will be demagogue, there will always be people who are looking for someone to help them understand, help them feel important. And Koresh is telling these people, you believe in God, you believe in the Bible. I can show you how God has chosen you to be the ultimate warriors, the heroes. And gradually, it just, it overwhelms them. They don't hear anybody else saying, wait a minute, this is crazy, because the people who think that are already gone. And it gets to the point where they can't admit anymore this guy fooled us. They've given up their friends. Some gave up their families. Men are giving up their wives. Wives are giving up their husbands. After all that, how are you going to admit, you know what? Maybe I was wrong after all. It just doesn't happen that way.
And in your reporting, were you able to find out how they were viewed by the wider community in McLennan County, both, the average people of the county and perhaps the law enforcement apparatus in Waco, McLennan County?
I've interviewed a lot of people who lived in Waco during this time and also law enforcement officers. As far as the other citizens of Waco were concerned, well, they're kind of weird, these Branch Davidians, but a lot of them work right in our community. Everything from checkers in the local HEB to lawyers doing business in the county courthouse. So far as the sheriff's department was concerned, well, every time there's supposedly been a problem, we go out there and check, and these people seem to be okay. The locals didn't know about the guns. The federal agents found out about it, but they really did not work in concert with the local officers, the local law enforcement, which was one of the mistakes they made. But in general, so far as the rest of Waco was concerned, these people were weird, but so what? I mean, every university campus has student groups that most of the students think, hey, those guys, I would never join them, but hey, they're not hurting anybody. Same thing here in Waco.
And you touched a little bit there on the mistakes made by the federal law enforcement organizations. I've heard you talk about this now a few times, and the the depth of the mistakes that were made from the attorney general being lied to, the initial raid by the ATF being telegraphed. Just we generally expect high levels of competence from organizations like the FBI. How did they get everything just so wrong in this case? So many, the ATF, the FBI. How did so many things manage to get mangled in this?
Mistakes made by the leadership of both agencies is what resulted in the horrible death of so many people, and for federal agents. We should never forget that. And that all could have been avoided. And yet, human mistakes, human fallacy, is something we can never completely eliminate from any organization, no matter how much we want to believe it's their obligation to get everything right. The biggest mistake both ATF and FBI made is that they never, ever wanted or felt they needed to understand what the Branch Davidians believed. If they'd just tried a little harder to learn that before they ever staged that first raid in February, or even the last final action, April 19th, almost 2 months later, they would have seen that these were people who truly believed it was going to be their privilege to die at the hands of government agents, that this was a reward from God. If they had understood that, the two agencies, they could have just kept on the siege at Mount Carmel. Water was running out in there. The people would have had to come out at some point, and nobody would have died. But because the agencies did not take a very important step to understand that these were people who were going to welcome death at their hands, everything else happened. That is not a plot. That is not some underground thing the government did, never going in intending for anybody to die. But it does show that those were two awful errors by ATF and FBI, and their leadership should have been held accountable for it.
And I think that begs the question: if we overrate the competency of an organization like the FBI, the thing I wonder is if there were more Mount Carmel type situations, would there be more Mount Carmel type results? Would those if they could make those mistakes in that situation, what's to stop them from happening again?
Well, one thing to make them a lot more careful was the public reaction afterwards. I'm not talking about the zealots who have used Mount Carmel as an excuse ever since to take up arms against the government and claim wrongly that they're only doing it to defend themselves. But it shook regular citizens' faith in these agencies. Now, today, particularly for younger citizens, now they're hearing all the time, oh, FBI's incompetent, ATF's corrupt, blah, 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 blah. And that's not true. 99% of the time, these agencies are not only efficient, but they keep us safe. They do the jobs they're supposed to do. When they screw up, it's always going to get more attention than the things they did right. ATF and the FBI both, I think, learned something from Mount Carmel, which is not just to go in without knowing who you're going in after, but it's also true that it's inevitable. As we have more situations today, as we're having, with citizens arming themselves and claiming the right to go ahead and fight government agents if they want to, some point, this is going to happen again. The only way it stops is if we don't give credence anymore to these rumors about plots and everything else. And if we understand better, there's demagogues out there and what the warning signs are. We do these two things, we can eliminate this kind of terror, this kind of danger.
In your reporting, you discovered that David Koresh's followers still believe in him, and they believe everything he said about the raid came true. How can that be?
Let's think a minute about living 30 years after what happened at Mount Carmel, with people discussing it, raving about it, raging about it. And somehow you're one of the lucky few who survived. About half the people who survived Mount Carmel were sent to prison for as long as 15 years for illegal guns, for interfering in law enforcement. Those who didn't go to prison were sort of labeled. They were known. They have been known ever since. Oh, that's one of the crazy ones who followed Koresh. With all this, and every one of them lost friends, most of them lost family members, parents, spouses, children. What are they going to do? Are they going to say at some point, I've thought about it and we were fooled? Or are they going to give themselves something to believe in, something to hang on to? That it says in Revelation that the Lamb, which Koresh claimed he was, and some of his followers would die at the hands of Babylon, but their souls would remain under an altar for a little while. Then God will translate them up to lead the armies of the Lord in a wonderful final battle against Babylon. So their choices are really, yes, I was a fool, and people I loved paid a terrible price for that, or we were right, and someday the rest of the world is going to find out. It's a very human thing to protect yourself by saying, I'm right and I don't care what anybody else says.
And does it say anything deeper about our susceptibility as humans to demagogues?
You bet. I mean, writing this book and some of the other ones I've done scares the hell out of me. And if you don't believe there's demagogues out there appealing to the worst in people, well, I would suggest you take a look at our current political arena. We've got Americans at each other's throats. All politicians are demagogues to a certain extent. I mean, they all go out there and say, vote for me or the country's going to hell. Vote for me or you're going to lose all your freedoms. But there are a few who are doing it more than others, and they're following the classic Charlie Manson, Jim Jones, David Koresh playbook. Promise apocalypse if you don't get exactly what you want, and anybody who disagrees with me is not just the enemy, but evil. This is permeating our society, and we have to stop it. We just have to say, look, there's always the warning signs. If anybody stands up and says that everything is terrible, I'm the only one that can fix it, and then follows by saying it's us against everybody else. Those are the two signs. This is a demagogue. Back away.
How did Waco become such a seminal moment for anti-government extremists when it doesn't seem to fit as neatly with their worldview as something like Ruby Ridge?
Ruby Ridge had happened 6 months before Waco. And Waco seemed to be just a bigger continuation of that to people who wanted to be suspicious of the government anyway. The other thing to remember is that 1993 at Mount Carmel, this was the first time there was anything available on television as 24/7 news. CNN was on the scene. Fox came later, all the other ubiquitous 24/7 news networks now that you can stream anytime. But this was really the first time Americans who were looking for reasons to be suspicious of the government anyway could turn on the TV and see something that if they wanted, they could interpret as the government trying to oppress innocent citizens. Media's had a lot to do with it, and social media has only increased the opportunity. You know as well as I do that you can go online at any time, and if you look even a little, you can always find some podcast, some internet self-appointed spokesperson who's going to say the kind of things you want to be true. And that reinforces the paranoia.
And is a form of demagoguery in its own right in some cases.
Well, let's look at what you're doing. You have an audience. There are people who believe if they listen to you, they're going to learn what they need to know. That's just a fact, right? Well, suppose you had some ambition in mind that you wanted to create yourself as more of a power figure. You could start throwing in a couple things every once in a while. Build up the heat bit by bit. Remember, these demagogues don't come out of nowhere. It takes them years to build up to the level they need to become truly dangerous. That's what happened with Koresh. That's what's going to happen with other people. Look at Alex Jones or somebody like that. It's going to keep happening until we start setting some kind of common sense boundary.
Let's end with this. A lot of the reviews of your book have drawn a line between Waco and January 6th, and you did
Yep.
that yourself at the beginning of this interview. What's that connection?
2 years to the day after Mount Carmel burned, a man named Timothy McVeigh blew up the federal building in Oklahoma City, claiming he was doing it in retaliation for what the government had done in Waco. A couple years after Mount Carmel burned, a big, burly, bearded man who'd been broadcasting primitive internet programs out of his garage in Austin showed up in Waco at a memorial service, grabbed the microphone, and claimed from now on he's going to go anywhere things like this happen and he's going to stop them. His name was Alex Jones. The people we're reading about right now who are being found guilty of sedition and acts against the government for what they did on January 6, 2021, all have their websites and their groups like the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys. You can look these up for yourselves. Every one of these sites claims Waco and Mount Carmel as one of the seminal reasons they decided they had to take up arms and violently oppose the government if that was necessary. So Waco is ground zero for the things we're seeing today. The people, some of them who are shouting loudest and getting the most attention, used Waco as their springboard. How can we possibly come to grips with the problems we're facing right now, the violence, the tension, the obvious plausibility that there is going to be more shooting, there's going to be more deaths, if we don't go back and try to understand where it all got started? Once we know what, let's use a biblical term, Genesis for today's problems was, then we can start understanding better where we are and what we need to do to change. That's why it's important to think about something that happened just outside Waco 30 years ago. We owe it to ourselves. We need to understand it.
Well, Jeff Guinn is the author of the new book, Waco, David Koresh, The Branch Davidians, and a Legacy of Rage. Jeff Guinn, thank you so much for joining the program today.
Thank you very much.